Hello, everybody, and welcome again to Procrastinator's Pit Stop. We have another amazing guest for you today. We have Dani Bicknell. Dani is the founder of and CEO of DabCollab, a consulting firm supporting social impact startups to grow sustainably with a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Author of The Restorative Rebel, Dani champions intersectional financial feminism and restorative entrepreneurship, offering a fresh perspective on breaking free from capitalist norms for a more equitable future. Dani, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we're glad to have you here. Now, before we dive into everything, we do like to have an icebreaker on the show. And the question for you today, Dani, is which cartoon character do you resonate the most with and why?
So that's a great question because I'm a child of the 90s. So, for better or for worse, I was exposed to a lot of cartoons, a lot of different characters. My brain was going between Ren and Stimpy, Rocco's Modern Life, even The Simpsons is an old favorite. But I think the cartoon character I resonate the most with is Daria. She was considered a little bit of a, I guess, outcast or a little bit of like a downer living in a high school and was always critiquing the world around her. And for better or for worse, I think when I was growing up, I really related to that. I didn't understand a lot of things in pop culture. I was always trying to look at things through like a intellectual, philosophical lens. So that's one that I keep coming back to. And I really love her deadpan humor as well. And so um, hopefully I aspire to that.
Excellent. I like that. I like that example. I think that's the first time anyone's used that example that I can remember. Why don't
Nice.
you tell us a little bit more about your journey and how you got to be where you are today?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a really interesting question. I grew up in California in the Bay Area, and I also grew up at a really interesting time, which was, as I mentioned, in the 90s, 2000s. And so I was part of a generation that grew up with analog. I remember the Dewey Decimal System, pagers, beepers, the internet with a really slow startup modem and that, but also spent most of my formative years with the rise of social media, smartphones, and now we have AI. In between that, though, I think my Daria-esque personality always made me look to the world with a global perspective. So I lived abroad for about 10 years, doing my undergraduate in Canada, then living in South America. I then came back to the Bay Area where I was primarily working in startups and then found this calling that I really wanted to work in international development, mostly from all of the work I had done previously. And so I used um, my, I'd say my background, my skills, my scrappiness to do a graduate degree program, which was interdisciplinary, but had a heavy focus on international policy and education. And that took me to France, where I lived for a few years working at the Gender Equality Division in UNESCO. Um, Fast forward a few years, I was sent back to the United States, where I set up shop in um, my hometown, San Francisco, California, and decided to focus on using more interdisciplinary skills. So, some international perspectives, cross cultural learnings from my travels, and then also startup and innovation. So, I became really passionate about human centered design, about how we can kind of use our multi hyphenate identities to build better products and services. So I designed and led a few accelerator programs at universities, in the private sector. And now I've decided to kind of combine all of those, you know, like non-linear experiences, if you will, into DabCollab. And so DabCollab is a single member LLC, fancy word for saying I love working for myself and I love helping others kind of define their own version of success. So I work with organizations anywhere from venture capital to foundations to think tanks to startups and organizations with specific initiatives or projects they want to scale. And then I also work with individuals that are usually first time founders, female founders, immigrant founders that don't speak English as a first language, but are working in the US market. And then I've also found a niche working with younger professionals, which has been really rewarding, and mostly what I do in my spare time.
That's quite an interesting journey you've had there, and thank you for sharing that. Every journey has its own set of challenges. I'd be interested in knowing, and I'm sure our audience would too. What do you think was the biggest challenge that you had to overcome during that time?
The first thing that came to mind was staying true to my own North Star. And so something that you mentioned earlier was authenticity and being authentic in this interview. And I think that's really, really important. So I consider staying true to my North Star a really big element of being authentic. As I mentioned, I grew up in the Bay Area with the rise of tech all around me. And yet I was really interested in international development, education without borders, gender equality, and was kind of told that I was like a fish out of water and I should, conform to what everyone else is doing around me. Then again, when I was working in international development, I had many people tell me it's kind of a dead end career. You're going to be working for like very little money, very little results. Most of the time, you're just catering to, big organizations that are really bureaucratic. You're not really creating any change. Back to my gosh, you're going to be working for yourself. Like that's going to be incredibly hard. You want to write a book on top of that? That sounds really challenging. And just having this internal voice that always said, this feels right, keep doing it. It will make sense eventually is something that is really important to me, but it's been the hardest thing for me to do because for better or for worse, I'm a people pleaser. I always wanted to be teacher's pet growing up. I always loved getting praise, whether it was personal praise or professional praise. So for a long time, as much as I tried to ignore this internal voice at the expense of my own well-being, but really with this desire to just please other people, make them like me no matter what, was really and continues to be really challenging. But as I get older and wiser, I have learned the hard way that if I continue to repress this authentic voice, if I continue to ignore my own North Star, I'm the one that's going to lose in the end. So authenticity is a big part of that, and it's also been a really big challenge to continue that journey.
No, and thank you for sharing that. That's something that it's something that many of us struggle with, and it's because society. Again, you just labeled it out clearly and perfectly that society, I guess, gears us towards that because it rewards you kind of fitting into a box that they can tick off. I mean, I told you before the show as well, authenticity is important to me because, again, I almost imploded my whole life. Again, jury's still out in a couple of aspects. But the more that you can be authentic and the more that you can follow your true North Star or your internal compass, the more that you're going to find that, you're going to be in places and situations where you're actually happier and you're more productive and all that fun stuff. Just heading back into procrastination here a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
What is procrastination to you, Dani, and how would you define it?
Oh, so I'll say what I think procrastination is, and the way I define it personally might be a little bit different. The way that I've seen it show up in like workplaces or in education or in society, as we might call it, is this idea of creating a lot of other things instead of doing the thing that you want to set out to do. So, an example could be I want to do this podcast, but I'm going to create a million reasons why I can't contact you. I'm going to put a bunch of things on my to-do list that prevent me from reaching out, instead of doing the thing that I really want to do, which is be on your podcast. And so I I see that show up in a lot of professional places and personal places, especially when people are wanting to try and um, do like creative endeavors or like invest in themselves. But the way that I procrastinate is a little bit different in the sense that if I have like something I want to achieve, I have no problem starting. I have a ton of problems finishing. I have, I would say, what you call a follow through problem. That is how I've been trying to address my procrastination. Is I think earlier I defined it the way I previously defined it. And I was like, oh, that's not my problem. I have no problem starting. But then what I realized is that procrastination is a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more multifaceted than that first part. And so I indeed do relate to being a procrastinator in terms of I will start something, but I can always find reasons to self sabotage along the way. I can always find issues, critiques, ways that maybe it's not the right time, not the right place. People won't like it. And so I think that both of those definitions are kind of how I envision procrastination. It just took me a little while to really realize that later definition.
No, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's such a huge topic. I mean, as my listeners know, and as a lot of the colleagues and the people I work with know, it is such a huge topic and it affects so many different things. But what I will say is that in what you're describing is not it's not uncommon, and it happens a lot in what we call dreamers or disruptors, because you want to make that change, but at the same time, for any number of reasons, like you said, you just don't follow through, and you could be something as simple as, like, well, all those reasons that you mentioned. So it's definitely not uncommon, and actually, the people pleasing part is not that uncommon either. I mean, I myself was a people pleaser for a long time. To be honest with you, there's still some cases where I am. So, that's not
Me
something
too.
that's out of the realm of possibility, right? Um, so what's been your sort of secret sauce to get over that?
I'm making a lot of mistakes and staying true to my North Star. So I think when I was younger, I was very impatient. I wanted things to happen quickly. And so I had stories and narratives that I would tell myself when I was a teenager or in my very early 20s, like, you're too old to do this. You're too old to follow through with these things, which now I find is hilarious, because I'm much older now, but I actually think I have a lot more time than I once thought, making a lot of mistakes, which I consider like all part of growing wiser and learning that sometimes you have to make mistakes a few different times in order to really know how to follow through, really know how to improve. And then the last one is like the clarity I get from sticking with my North Star. So after a period of time, I started realizing that I've made enough mistakes, but I still have this desire to be creative, to write, to help other people. And so, as much as that might take different shape, as long as I'm staying true to that kind of special sauce that you mentioned, I can usually overcome a lot of my procrastination, which I think is really rooted in like fear or shame. And so by kind of looking back on those three elements, I can usually overcome it easier or much easier than I have before.
Well, it's good to hear that you found your own secret sauce to deal with it, because I mean everybody's different. You do have these standardized sort of cookie cutter type things, but at the end of the day, everybody's unique. So there's always some unique take on it. So
Hmm.
thank you for sharing.
Oh, well, you know what I can also mention, because I feel like that was a little bit more abstract, is for day to day, what has really been helpful, which might be helpful for some of your listeners, is I treat my calendar like a to-do list for everything I need to do, and not just for work things. It's like if I need time to prep before this meeting, I put that in my calendar so people can't actually block time. I put take a walk, eat lunch, drink water, read a few articles, like everything related to the things that are really important to me, I actually put in there, because I find that when I look at my calendar, it's very easy for me to forget those things. The people pleaser in me is like, well, it's not on my calendar, so I don't have to do it. And I don't have to be accountable to anybody else because they can see exactly what's on my calendar. But when I block actually those things out, not only does my calendar fill up, but it helps me remind myself to continue doing the thing. Don't put it off. Don't forget it. So hopefully that's like a more practical tidbit.
No, you're absolutely right, and thank you for that. And for anybody who thinks that maybe that's there is also a secondary benefit to that. You said about filling up the calendar. In sales and different psychologies, they often say that you want to only have certain times available anyway. So as long as you're scheduling that, you're kind of killing two birds with one stone. But I really like that.
I like that too.
Where, yeah. Now let's talk a little bit about the book. I've probably used this a little bit too much, and I'm probably going to get a slap on the wrist for it from somebody in my audience. But they say that writing a book is 98% procrastination and 2% writing. How true has that been for you?
Yes. Yes. Because in so many ways, this book was 10 years procrastination and 10 months of writing. And now I am in the final design stages. So it's almost happening. And yet, with each stage, I can always find little ways to procrastinate around it. So even with that timeline, there are percentages of how much is really just me thinking about it, worrying about it, and then very little time actually doing it. And so I think that procrastination for writing a book, in my from my experience, has actually been really helpful. I've always loved writing. I've always been a ferocious reader. I love learning. But when I was quite young, I want to say like 15 or 16, I heard a quote from someone that said, how can you sit down and read, or how can you sit down and write when you have not stood up and lived? And that quote at a really early age resonated with me, because I felt like I need to really like live and experience and learn from the world and people around me before I can have some opinions. And then I also was quite, it's like, I'd say Facebook came to my university when I was 18. And so that was the beginning of everyone kind of just talking about their lives very publicly, posting things, and people becoming influencers and experts. And I never felt like I qualified as one. And I always felt very reserved and wanting to put things out there without really thinking them through. So even something as like a Twitter post, some people, I think it can be really authentic to just share what's on top of your mind. Especially in the early days, I was the one that would like write it out and I'd look it over and then I'd like think about it and then I'd say, oh, that doesn't sound right. And then I'd post it. And then, of course, I would worry about it for a long time. So I think that that was good in a lot of ways, because when I finally decided to sit down and write this book, I realized that I had been writing this book for 10 years. I had been blogging, I had been posting on social media, I had been writing policy reports, doing policy briefs and debriefs and interviews and um, cataloging all of it. But I never felt like I was like worthy enough of putting it out into the world. And the pandemic was a really introspective time for me where I had much more time in my house or in my in where I was living than I did before. And so I started going through a lot of that writing. I also started listening a lot more than feeling compelled to speak. And while I was listening, I would usually do like what I call listening tours. And so I would meet up with a colleague of mine, a mentor of mine, or an entrepreneur I was advising. And I would say, I just want to hear about like your experiences regarding this subject. I just want to learn about your take on what's happening right now for you. And I would just kind of like take notes for myself and not really do anything with them. And then once I started working for myself, I started thinking about all of these years of writing. I started thinking about all of these conversations, and people started asking, like, where can I find this? And so that really motivated me to actually recategorize, resynthesize, put everything in one place, which, as I said, took about 10 months, but it was about 95% of me thinking about it, critiquing it, thinking it wasn't good enough. And I still think in many ways it's not good enough, as I like butcher the details of design and as I look over my citations for the third time. But what I've learned as well, to complement your quote, is sometimes done is better than perfect. And so some of my friends that have written works that are, my book is part memoir, it's also part critique. Um, they're like, you know what? You can save that for the next one. You don't have to prevent putting out your work now because you don't think it's perfect. Put it out. It's important. It feels ready. It feels good. And then all the stuff that you're thinking about after you put it out, write that in the second one, which who knows how long I'll procrastinate about that one.
No, you hit the nail on the head there too about you know, how many people they a lot of people think that about writing a book. But maybe not, well, maybe more people do it now, but I know before a lot of people had those same sort of thoughts. I mean, I used to have those same kinds of thoughts too, that little imposter, that little gremlin that's in the back of your head saying, who am I to be telling you this? And I think that a lot of the times that actually stems from just society in general, because we don't put value on experience. We put value on dollars. We put value on papers and diplomas. We put value on, schooling, or value on, how big a car I have or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's really the experiences that are worthwhile. So happy to hear that you've gone through that and you've actually gone out to be able to write that.
Thanks for saying that. It still feels fresh. But yeah, I actually think that you're touching on a point that I talk about a lot in my book, and I share a lot in my work. Is I consider us all multi-hyphenate identities. And if when I say multi-hyphenate, I think of a pie. And a very small slice of that pie is the jobs you've had, the degrees you've earned, the professional accolades, the money in your bank account. But a much bigger part of that pie is actually the lived experiences you've had, because they really formulate like your work ethic, your values, your principle. They also inform your biases. We all have biases, whether we want to admit it or not. And our lived experiences help formulate them. So I always tell people, that's a much bigger part of what makes you special. And also, it's a much more moldable part because you can add on experiences. If you have a bias and you learn something new that challenges that bias, you're molding that part of you. And that can get richer, that can get deeper versus, the money, the jobs you've had, the degrees you've had, those are pretty static. The money might go up and down, but it's not something that I think is like moldable or changeable, that really creates like depth or like emotional wealth and growth.
Actually, just going back to that a little bit into the book as well. One of the aspects that really stood out to me, and maybe you could talk just a little bit about it,
hmm
was this internalized capitalism. Could you explain to us a little bit about what that is?
Yeah. So I talk about internalized capitalism in the book because it's something that I think shows up more often than not. And it really is something that I struggle with. And so capitalism is an economic system, and many philosophers, economists talk about it. It's this idea that uh, businesses create wealth, and they, in fact, own and navigate the means of production. I am not talking about it as an economical system, although there are parts of the book where I critique it. I really talk about how it shows up in us as individuals, in business practices, and at society at large. And so some of these aspects are defining your own worth based on your productivity, how much money you've made, how many things you're doing, your job title, prioritizing your well-being only if it can be commodified or if it can scale, or even looking at things that make you happy, like rest, like hobbies, as something that needs to be commodified. It needs to have some type of end goal. Um, I I talk about this idea in the book when I talk about, there was a point in my life where I liked writing just because I liked writing. I had a journal. I loved writing little short stories. And then one day, I don't remember who, somebody was saying, yeah, but what are you going to do with it? Are you just going to write? And I had never really thought about it beyond that point. I was just like, no, it's something that makes me happy. It's a hobby. And then what I noticed in the like late 2000s with like the kind of online commodification of like everything, you're a social media influencer, but everything you post can be commodified and it can be measured, and you can get business deals from writing a poem or from talking about an experience. And that can lead to other professional opportunities. But what I found for me is that that didn't make me happy. I really wanted to focus on the things that made me happy. And that was hard to do in what I felt like a society that was constantly asking me, but your worth is tied in your productivity. So you need to continue producing. And when you're producing, it needs to have an end goal. And the second that you hit that end goal, you need to start another project right away, which a lot of people talk about this idea of like infinite growth, of scaling. And as humans, we're not robots. So when we talk about those concepts, we can talk about them for some things, but we can't talk about those for humans because humans need rest. We need to sleep. We need water. We need food. And also what I think our society, like what makes humans different than a lot of other animals is we need connection. We need to be with people that we love. We create families by blood, but we also have friends, which are families we choose. And so if we aren't making time for that, then that can really, I think, harm our well-being. And so my definition of internalized capitalism is this idea that we can just continue to produce, continue to put our value around really narrow financial metrics instead of, as I was previously saying, like looking at ourselves as multi-hyphenate individuals where the majority of our experiences are really what make us a valuable human being. And part of that experience is connecting with others, resting, or having a hobby just for the hell of it, just because it makes you happy and not really seeing any need to go beyond that.
Well, you mentioned something really good there, and I always go back to, especially when I coach people as well on it. We're not human. We're not human doings. We're human beings. So just being is enough, and it's we have the tangible and the intangible benefits, right? So I mean, you're talking about things that bring you happiness and joy. And while that may not translate directly to some sort of, monetary value, in the end, it will lead to some sort of monetary value because when you're happier, you will be more productive and you will be able to spread that happiness to other people. So even if you didn't do something, so let's take writing your book as an example. If you had a really close friend who was advising you on the book and they were always depressed and they were always upset and they were always, just generally grumpy, that would drag on you. And obviously you might lose productivity in your book, right? And I'm sure that you go over this with companies as well in terms of company morale, right? But if you do nothing, okay, well, again, just being is something. But
Mm-hmm.
if you're doing something that makes you happy and you're spreading that, and then that friend comes to you and they're always happy, they're always bubbly. They haven't quote unquote done anything, but they're passing that energy onto you. And that in itself
Mm.
is enough of an exchange to, be worth something.
I think, yeah, I think you are actually defining internalized capitalism in a way as well. I think that when you were talking about human doing and human being, I think that is definitely an element. I think that when you're talking about the energy passing on and how it can create kind of like this wealth of community because it gives you energy to do something, that is definitely a part of it. And actually, what I was going to say after is internalized capitalism shows up differently for everyone. So the definition that I gave is really something personal of how it showed up for me and all the reasons why I chose not to do something or to procrastinate or put something off. And when you were using that example, it was making me realize that that aspect has been really important to me continuing on with this journey. To continue writing this book is I will get people that will say, why are you doing this? That seems really hard. That doesn't seem worth it. And that's not always something that deters me. But to your point, if I only had the negative advice, if I only had that depressed friend, I don't think we would be sitting here today. I would probably be in my bed, hiding from the world. But having like a really rich community of people that I feel like safe and welcomed by, and that also give this supportive energy that comes with like sparks of critique, sparks of feedback, but like feeling that support, I think is really important. And so, yeah, I appreciate you kind of like building on my definition.
Well, it's very interesting, and I mean, a lot of people don't take that into consideration, right? The all about self care, all about and like to your point, we are social animals, so if we don't get that, and it goes back to people pleasing too, right? I mean,
Hmm.
what causes a people pleaser is you've had that negative experience in your life at some point, and then you've realized at some point that by fitting in and by you know behaving in a way or doing something that makes other people well, I guess I could go on a limb and say happy. I don't know, that they feel in agreement with you, then you feel accepted, and
Hmm.
then that just leads into that pattern of behavior. So I mean, it's not something that is it's not a bad thing. It's just something that we need to take a look at and just share with one another, and just understand that maybe if somebody's trying really hard, maybe we should go out of our way to encourage that rather than, say, okay, well, no, that's dumb. Why are you doing it?
No, I think actually that's really an apt observation because I see the intent behind people pleasing be misconstrued all the time. For me, in terms of how I've defined internalized capitalism, my productivity is what's measurable. And so if I'm looking to people that can give me a thumbs up that I'm doing a good job, then I will naturally want to conform and adapt to them. And in some situations, that's great. I love collaborating on projects. I don't like being, a solo entrepreneur all the time. I really enjoy working with others. So that can be really valuable. However, if somebody sees people pleasing as they're just willing to do whatever in order to make that person happy, I've also shared with clients that I've worked with that you're not going to build innovative products and solutions. And so I've noticed people in high positions of power, they tend to gravitate towards hiring people that will always agree with them, always say what they want to hear, and that might be effective in the short run if you need that personal support. But if you're trying to build, a really disruptive, innovative company, it's actually can do the opposite. And, it can actually lead to a lot of procrastination because you've got this kind of wheel of agreeability as everyone's like, yep, you're doing a great job. Yeah, 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 yeah. And if you're stuck in that wheel, then I think you can start to go down some kind of destructive paths because you're not really able to have somebody say, hey, actually, I don't really think that. And it's not because I don't want to please you. It's because this is authentically what I think, and I think it's the best for the company. So I also try and when I work with executives, I try to disassociate those two things. Is when you're in a position of power, you're always going to have somebody that's going to want to please you. But when somebody really wants to do right by the company and the mission, then note that just because they're saying something you specifically don't want to hear or that irks you, try and separate that and get to the point that of course they want to make you happy, but maybe they're saying it because they think it's what's best for the company.
I like that. I really like that insight. This has been a really great conversation, Danny. We are coming up towards the end of the time. Do you think that there was anything that I could have asked that I didn't ask, or any topic that we should have covered but we didn't cover?
You know, what I really liked about this podcast as opposed to other ones I've been on is it really felt like a conversation. And so there was at one point I kind of forgot that you were like interviewing me. I was like, oh wow, we're just having like a really nice conversation and building off of each other. So off the top of my head, I would say no, because I think that hopefully for your readers, they'll engage with the dialogue instead of maybe like the interviewer interviewee format. But aside from that, no, I think we're good.
Okay, well, just before we go, Dani, what would be the best way for our listeners to reach out and get in touch or ask a question, send praise?
Yeah. So my book is coming out soon, hopefully in the next month or two. And so if you are interested in getting updates, I send out newsletters. So you can go to DaniBicknell.com. And there is a link to both the work that I do at DabCollab, and then there is a link to the book. So if you go to Dani Bicknell, there's ways that you can get in touch with me. You can get updates about the book, and you can also probably listen and watch this podcast.
Well, and to all our listeners, don't worry, we will be having that in the show notes as per usual, so that you'll be able to have easy access to that. And just once again, Dani, thank you so much for being on the show. I mean, a lot of great insights. I'm personally looking forward to the book, so you better not procrastinate on getting it out anymore.
Yep.
Okay. And again, to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in. And just remember, if you can't find that inspiration or motivation for yourself today, maybe just go out and try to be that motivation or inspiration for someone else. And we'll see you again next time.
Thanks